Welcome to a Pulp event podcast, brought to you by the PulpNet, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines, for over 20 years, online at thepulp.net. In this Pulp event podcast, David Saunders, artist, art historian, and son of pulp artist, Norman Saunders, talks about women artists in the pulps. The talk was recorded on August 16, 2019, at PulpFest 2019 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Thank you. Oh, good. You're supposed to clap now. Come on, man. All right. All right. So when I first, when I first suggested this topic for PulpFest, Mike said, "Oh, that's a great idea, women pulp artists, because it's like the year of the hashtag Me Too movement and everything." And he said, "So let's call it Babes in Bikinis with Brushes." I was like, "What the? No, I can't do that. And so then my daughter, I said, "This boob came up with this idea, babes in bikinis with brushes." And my daughter said, it was worse. And my daughter said, "What about the secret life of women pulp artists?" And I go, "Oh, that sounds good, yeah." So we had to, anyway. So I have this website for pulp artists, and a lot of them are just really great people. I knew a lot of them because my dad was one, and it was kind of, the more I looked into it, the more, one time I brought home some pulps and said, "Are these by you, Dad?" And he goes, "Are you kidding? These aren't by me. This is Rudy Bolarski. Don't you know the difference?" And so I was like 10, and so I was like, "Well, I better learn the difference between these guys." So I started then like trying to figure out who they were and stuff, but so I've documented over 700 pulp artists, and I was surprised that of that, I've only found 19 that are women. And so, the field of illustration is highly competitive, and the guys, fought for their work. They liked each other, they played together and stuff, but, they were cutthroat about getting the jobs because they really needed them. So you can sort of imagine that, I don't know, I'm bad at math, but the percentage of 19 out of 700, you can see that the women, the deck was stacked against them. So they must have been people with, a tremendous amount of talent and perseverance to try and, face the personal challenges of sexist world and gender challenges and stuff. And so each of these women that we're going to look at tonight, because we can't do all 19 in 45 minutes, it would be disrespectful. So I picked out 8 of them, and but they're probably all have lived heroic lives. So we're going to look at a little of their work, and I'll tell you brief little stories about their lives. So each artist, kind of like in terms of fashion or something like that, their career only lasts a limited amount of time before they have to either change or move on to something else. So all illustration is kind of a little bit, has one foot in the world of fashion in a sense. But so I mostly document people from 1900 to 1950 of that first half of the century. So each of these artists kind of covers a different little era. So I've just organized them in terms of the earliest one first, and we just move through it that way. So this is Dorothy Flack. She was actually born Dorothy McDaniel in 1902 in New Jersey, and her father was the pastor at the Hoboken Lutheran Church. At the age of 15, she got out of school and worked in New York City at a import business, selecting fashions for women to be sold at an import company, producing catalogs and stuff of all types of stuff, but her section was just women's clothing. But then by the age of 18, she was already a fashion designer, making her own ideas of what would be a cool-looking clothing. Then when the Great War was over, she married her second cousin, whose name was Walter Flack. And he was 20 years old and was a veteran, a lieutenant, and served overseas. And 2 weeks after they were married, he went on a hunting trip with his best friend and was accidentally killed. And so both of them, after they had been married, did not tell their parents about it, and they both continued to live at their parents' homes, and for whatever reason. And during the police investigation, during this accidental death of her husband, it came out that she was married to him. And so her parents were shocked to find out that their 19-year-old daughter was a widow. But she began to be known from then on as Dorothy Flack instead of Dorothy McDaniel. And she never remarried, and she never had any children. So she started drawing in the style that was very popular at the time, when the frizzy-haired Mary Pickford was the most important thing from womanhood in America at that time. And she was hired by William Randolph Hearst and became a nationwide syndicated artist, drawing these beautiful little frizzy-haired characters that appeared on women's pages and have sometimes women's fiction and stuff like that. And she then, from that, also was making beautiful drawings for, again, women's type magazines, romantic magazines. And she's probably the most widely exposed, I guess. And she was so popular that they began to use her pen and ink drawings on the covers. But in each time, she was still just a pen and ink line artist. So they had some other person that was a specialist called a colorist, and they would actually do the coloring during the printing process. So she, as time went on, she kept trying to, keep her stuff lively and not just always look like Mary Pickford. And she started, she probably was the highest paid, but she's the most frequently appearing Dorothy Flack signature in Love Pulps. But she also would use photographs of movie stars, and so that her characters, instead of looking like Mary Pickford, started looking like Judy Garland or Ginger Rogers and stuff like that. And she primarily, worked for All Story Love. She did a tremendous amount of work for them, but she also worked for like Love Story. And in fact, most of the women's type pulp magazines were the most lucrative of all pulps. So if you took them out of the field, the actual field may have collapsed under its own weight. And so there was a huge contribution in terms of the volume of pulps that were sold that were to women. And they were usually almost always, I can think of as just romance or Western romance type themes. But she continued to work until 1941. And all of her work has a kind of a angelic sweetness to it, basically. But by 1941, that actually had become out of date, and there was more interest in some sort of more of a sultry kind of women and stuff. So she retired from illustration and moved to California. She remained in the field of fashion because that was where she had begun. And I suppose if you wanted to catalog all her work, the clothing that people are wearing and all of her things are probably up to date. Every single illustration from 1922 to 1941 that she does. But the last thing I found on her was in 1963, and there was a notice in a newspaper about a charity that was selling Easter hats. And the quote said that these hats were donated from all of the top New York City hat shops through an exclusive arrangement by Dorothy Flack. So in 1963, she still had some sort of a fashion pull in that thing. She bought a house in Santa Monica, and she lived to the age of 87. The next person we're going to look at is Thelma Gooch. She's born in 1895 in Cleveland, and her mother was Frances Pusey. I'd never heard of her, but she was an authoress of plays and novels, and so that had to a big factor in her interest in becoming an illustrator. And her father was named Robert Gooch, and he was an insurance salesman. He was very successful. He traveled all over the world. She graduated high school in 1913, and she was really interested in becoming an artist. Unfortunately, in 1914, her dad had a nervous breakdown, and of all things, there was a new clinic in New York City, and that was to treat people with psychiatric problems. And I'm not sure that it was probably extremely unique. So the whole family left Cleveland and moved to New York City. The person that ran the sanitarium was named Dr. Elliot Dold. And he had two sons, Douglas Dold and Elliot Dold Jr. And Elliot Dold Jr. was an artist, and Douglas Dold was would grow up to become a renowned pulp editor. And they were both really interesting characters. So the Elliot Dold Jr. was studying at the New York Art Students League, and he convinced Thelma Gooch, who wanted to be an artist, to go with him and attend the school. So they studied with Frank Dumont and George Bridgman, who at that time were probably, I would think, the best art teachers in America. So she worked with Frank Dumont and became like an extremely accomplished illustrator. And in the 1920s, she was illustrating, again, children's books and romance books. So women are kind of marginalized into these topics. But she was quite successful, and she lived up in New Rochelle, which was where Rockwell and Leyendecker and Howard Chandler Christie all were in this kind of, I don't know, shishi, but anyway, it was definitely like a hip place for the top illustrators to live, Cole Phillips. And by the time the 1930s rolled around, children's books were too expensive, basically, for most families. So along with all the other industries that were kind of devastated by the Great Depression, the children's book industry slowed down considerably. And so she had to look for some other kind of work. And at the time, the only thing that was really selling like hotcakes were pulps, oddly enough, because you could buy them for a couple pennies, and they were tons of vast entertainment for everybody. So she started drawing pulps, and she worked for like All Story Love, Sweetheart Stories, Cupid's Diary, Ranch Romances, and Love Story. But she always left her work unsigned because she had already had this pretty big reputation as a children's book illustrator. And I guess maybe some of the stories might be slightly racy or something, but they're not really. But she just wanted to preserve her reputation as a children's book illustrator. So here's one of the rare examples of her work, which was signed. You can see it maybe in the lower right corner. It says Gooch. So she was really prolific, and she had a kind of a fun and playful way of drawing. And they're still self-expressive of her character. Like if you get into it, you can recognize it from thing to thing. Even though, like in this instance, if you look in the lower right corner, it's signed Dan O'Dare. And I was puzzled over why it's called Dan O'Dare, but it's a man's name. But Dan O'Dare, there's not too many Irish people called O'Dare, but I was thinking about it, and it seemed like a turn of a phrase of the whole thing was just done on a dare, but I don't know. Pure conjecture. Her fame as a children's book illustrator did last throughout the Depression, and in 1941, Grosset and Dunlap published the Thelma Gooch ABCs, and you see her name at the top of the book. So she continued to draw, even after 1941, interior illustrations for pulp magazines for another 10 years. She never married and she had no children. In 1960, she retired completely and moved to Scottsdale, Arizona, where she lived to the age of 78. So next one we got is Marjorie Stocking. She's born in 1888 in East Orange, New Jersey, and her father was a very successful newspaper editor. She first demonstrated artistic talent when she was 7 years old and astonished her mom and dad by drawing incredibly lifelike portraits of everyone in the family. She studied with the famous William Merritt Chase Art School, which was a spun-off from the Art Students League because they were too stodgy and Chase wanted it to be more radical. But when she also went to study at the Art Students League, she studied with the same teacher that Thelma Gooch had, Frank Dumont. And Dumont also had a second school in Connecticut called the Old Lyme School. And so she would go up there in the summers and study with him up there, which is kind of a bohemian artist colony. And so that was a big part of her early life. In 1914, she had her own column in newspapers illustrating topics that were maybe they thought related to woman subject matter. But I can't think of a single other illustrator of pulps that had a newspaper column. And one of the most remarkable things I found was that in 1916, when Griffith brought out his Birth of a Nation, in nationwide ads for the Birth of a Nation, it says that Marjorie Stocking of the New York Herald highly recommends it. Isn't that amazing? So she married a guy that she'd met at the old Lyme Art School, and he was a veteran and an archaeologist, but she was already 40 years old, and so they had no children, and they lived with her parents in Brooklyn. And even though she was married, she continued to always work under the name Marjorie Stocking. She began to draw illustrations for Blue Book, and you can see in the down here in the corner, it says there's an interwoven MS signature, and that was all she was ever known as in pulps. I don't believe her name was ever printed out. During World War II, she replaced, the male cover artists and became instead of just a line artist, she became a cover artist. And her work continued to appear for the next 14 years. There was some kind of an idea that the editors had that the artists that were women would be more appealing to the women readers for ranch romances. And so in fact, the authors and the artists in ranch romances typically have women's names, even though many of them are men. And so men were working here under feminine type names. So everything about her work is kind of cute, I think, and just kind of adorable. But I think I look at her work and I can recognize there's something within her personality that's very positive as a person. So I consider it completely self-expressive. It's not as if she's trying to make cheerful stories for people. I think she just happens to be that kind of person. And these always just have an MS somewhere. Like in this case, it's on the woman's green skirt. By the end of the war, she'd painted 45 covers for the Ranch Romances. But the patriotic ethic of the times was that when the soldiers returned from the war, the women were supposed to vacate their jobs, even though women had, these were once restricted positions that women never had a chance to do before. But Rosie the Riveter, left the assembly line at the end of the war. And so Marjorie Stocking did the same thing. And she obligingly retired. She moved to San Francisco and worked as an art teacher at an art school out there. And then her and her husband moved back to Connecticut and near Old Lyme, where they had met. And she would make still lives and landscapes and sell them at tourist shops. And in 1979, she had a retrospective show, and that was how I found out that she was responsible for all this stuff, because they had her still lives and landscapes, but then they had these remarkable pen and ink illustrations and these covers that are all signed MS. And so that was eye-opening for me. One of the reporters that interviewed her, there's a great quote, I'll just read it. She said, "These paintings are my children. I'm so happy to see them on display. My only remaining ambition is to live to be 100 and to have another one-man show," unquote. In those days, it's a one-man show. But in fact, in 1986, she did have a second one-person show, and it was at the healthcare center where she and her husband were residents, where she lived to be 105. Now we're on to Zoe Mozart. She was born Alice Adele Moser in 1907 in Colorado. In 1921, her dad invented a cast iron stove, and so they were going to manufacture it in Philadelphia, so the whole family moved to Philadelphia. So she was raised in Philadelphia, and during her teenage years, she studied at the Philadelphia Museum School of Industrial Art. And that's a cool school because the teacher was Thornton Oakley, and he had been a student of Howard Pyle. And like his best friend was N.C. Wyeth. And so Wyeth would come by and teach at the school and stuff just to bum around with his old friends. And she won a scholarship to go to New York and study at the Art Students League. And while there, she started working for magazines. And she adopted the name Zoe Mozart. And so her birth name was Moser, but she thought Mozart was more catchy. And she came up with the name Zoe. She said, quote, "I looked through a name dictionary for a new first name, and I just couldn't find any I liked until I finally got to the last page, and that's where I saw Zoe, so I took it." It's just a coincidence, but my daughter's name's Zoe. During the Great Depression, she created a lot of really sensuous and glamorous colors for pulp magazines, such as Love Revels, Nightlife Tales, and Smart Love Stories. There's an odd thing about her as a person is that she was quite good looking, and she earned a lot of her income during her struggling years as a model for other artists. And so she appears in a lot of other artists' work. And she's actually featured in a lot of the earliest work by H.J. Ward, When you see a blonde in the early works, it's always her modeling for him. But she also would set up with her camera with an auto timer and photograph herself, so that she also appeared in her own magazine. All of her advertisements frequently use herself in them. She worked for like American Weekly and Romantic Movie Stories and Screen Stories, as well as pulp magazines. And Fawcett Publications, that produces Romantic Story magazine and True Confessions, became like a major. Oh, I messed up my pages. Give me a second here. Why did that happen? Oh well, maybe I can do it without her. So anyway, she did a ton of work for Fawcett Publications. Became like their real top artist, and she produced her work with pastel on paper rather than oil on canvas. And that was a technique that Ralph Armstrong and Earl Christie and Earl Moran all did sensuous pinups using pastel on paper. And she became really, really good at it. And she did ads for like magazines like Dr. Pepper, Cool Cigarettes, and Irresistible Beauty Aids. And so she did all these ads because there were famous actors and actresses from Hollywood that were endorsing the products. And everybody in Hollywood really liked her portraits of them. So that was kind of, it became an ideal. And so when Hollywood produced a film called True Confessions, they hired her to do the poster for it. And she became more involved with the Hollywood. So it's kind of a little bit like a self-fulfilling prophecy or something. She also did the controversial poster for The Outlaw. After the war, she got a 15-year contract to work with Brown and Bigelow, and which was the big, the most successful calendar manufacturer in America. So she basically was in millions and millions of homes during that time. And you know she made good money then. So in 1978, she retired from illustration, moved to Arizona, where she continued to do portraits of people, and she lived to the age of 85. And that's Zoe Mozart. Now we're on to the famous Margaret Brundage. She was born Margaret Hedda Johnson. Am I going too fast? Is this just too much information? Kind of sickening, right? Okay. They're all a lot older than you would imagine, I think. Like, she's born in 1900. She was raised by her mother and her grandmother, who were devout Christian Scientists. So that sort of set the pace a little bit for an unusual streak in Margaret Brundage. She graduated from high school and studied fashion design at the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts. In 1925, she got her first professional job drawing pen and ink drawings for the fashion industry. And in 1927, she married a guy named Myron Slim Brundage. And they had a son, Carrie Lynn Brundage. And her husband was a labor activist, and for that reason, he was constantly being fired from his job as he would try to unionize wherever he was. And I don't know if it's connected or not, but he was a severe alcoholic also. So he was not able to support the family and was in fact not even around most of the time because I guess the forces, were looking for him. So he kind of had to, he was a negligent parent. So her Christian Science mother moved in with him to help raise the son. Her first Pulp cover was in the summer issue, 1932, of Oriental Stories. And she went on to produce covers for the same publisher, such as The Magic Carpet and the legendary Weird Tales. So Brundage sold 66 covers to Weird Tales from 1932 to 1945. Her work always features sensuous women in fantastical situations. Her covers were really popular with the readers, and I think I probably have it wrong, but it's something true in this statement that it's like Ray Bradbury or somebody, or Asmanoff or somebody said, the first time I ever saw a nude woman in my life was a Margaret Brundage cover of Weird Tales, and I just became fascinated with the fantasy fiction because of that. So it's weird that you could maybe say she, influenced him. But some people wrote in letters objecting to her, the sexuality in the covers. But, she always signed everything M. Brundage, so it was a gender-neutral name. So the editor thought maybe he could silence these critics by somehow, so he publicly revealed the fact that, well, you think these are really horrible, but in fact they're created by a woman. So I don't know if that calmed the storm or not, but it made her even more sensational to the readers, thinking that, wow, I've been looking at sexual fantasies of a woman, not of another guy. And so that had to have been a sort of a wake-up call for people. So this particular cover right here is in the news lately because it sold a couple weeks ago for $72,000. Aside from her remarkable aesthetic approach to making pulp art, she's also another one of the women, another one of the artists that had a unique thing of working as pastel on paper instead of a canvas. And so there's just a lot of unique things about her. After the publishers of Weird Tales moved to New York City in 1938, Brundage never really again found a replacement as a steady publisher, so of having constant, source of income. But she continued to create work, and she, for her own appetite, she also made equally fantastic artwork of her own, which has never been shown, and that she just kept for herself. And she did it for the rest of her life. She finally won a divorce against her husband for negligence, and it's kind of unusual for a woman to win that type of thing in those days. So again, it's a strange life of struggle. Margaret Brundage spent the rest of her life in utter poverty and lived to the age of 75. This is a fun one for me. This is Alice Kirkpatrick. She was born in 1912 in Huntsville, Alabama. In 1930, at the age of 17, she graduated from high school, and she studied art courses from the International Correspondence School of Scranton, PA. This is the same school where Rudy Belarski got all of his training. In 1935, she left Alabama and moved to New York to seek her fortune as a commercial artist. She began to illustrate stories in pulp magazines, at first primarily from Ace magazines, and her work is signed Kirk. And I spent many years trying to find out who Kirk was. She also worked, for Love Book and Love Fiction and Complete Love, but they all have Kirk, K-I-R-K, written in the corner, which is, a masculine sounding name. She also created dust jackets for a couple hardcovers in New York City. And in 1949, she began to have a whole new career as a romance comic book illustrator. And again, she had done, these are from the same publisher that she was working for before, but they were producing Love comics. So she worked for real love, comics, all romances, love at first sight, revealing romances, glamorous romances, 10-story love. And I only repeat that long list because I'm trying to build a case that she actually has a very significant career. She did a ton of work. Now, I don't know if everybody knows this guy, Lou Cameron, but he started out as an artist, and he became also a really good paperback writer, I'm told. And he had this quote about Alice Kirkpatrick that if you'll forgive me, I will read to you for a minute. It's a little long, but it's cool. This is Lou Cameron talking. Alice Kirkpatrick was one of the finest romance illustrators in the business. She was the mainstay at Ace Romances during the Golden Age. Her girls were the prettiest. Alice Kirkpatrick was so good it was discouraging. If she was a guy, I would have hated her guts. She blocked out her compositions with a couple of pencil lines and worked entirely freehand. She worked with a semi-dry brush and could get the effect of a human eye or the notch in a woman's lapel with a glob of half-dried goo. The results were Liz Taylor and Lisbeth Scott playing opposite Gregory Peck with a stylish suburban landscape in the background. Kirk's stuff was up to the standards of slick romance illustration. Last I heard, she owned a couple of fancy apartments up in the 70s on the west side, and she hangs out with the jet set. Alice was something in her own right. On top of being a great artist, she was one hellishly beautiful woman. She looked like a cross between Deborah Carr and Katharine Hepburn. My own standing offer of matrimony still stands. Never, I hasten to add, voiced aloud to Miss Kirkpatrick, because we were, as the columnists say, just friends. Matter of fact, I don't think I made any impression on her at all. Sob. Unquote. She never married, and she had no children. In 1977, at the age of 65, she retired from commercial art and moved to Florida, where she lived to the age of 84. All right, this one, you gotta fasten your seatbelts for this one. This is Irene Zimmerman. She's born in 1907 in Brooklyn. Her father, Frederick Zimmerman, was born in Germany. Her mother, Emily Endres, was born in Hungary. They lived in Brooklyn in the home of her grandma and grandpa, who were the Endres, grandma and grandpa Endres, and they owned a Hungarian restaurant in New York. In 1923, Irene completed the 10th grade of high school and entered the workforce as a clerical worker. Every weekend, she studied free art classes at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. In 1929, Irene Zimmerman was 22 years old and earning an income as a freelance commercial artist. She sold several cover paintings to the Golden Book magazine, a literary monthly with short stories and serialized novels. She also illustrated hardcover dust jackets for Grosset and Dunlap. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, Irene Zimmerman began to draw pen and ink interior illustrations for spicy pulps like La Prairie and Pep stories. Most artists who worked for these erotic magazines preferred to leave them unsigned, but for whatever reason, she signs them with her full name, Irene Zimmerman, which you could, if you have a microscope, you can see it in the lower left corner. She also, in 1934, sold 2 cover illustrations to Liberty magazine. These are probably her most prestigious assignments from her entire career. At that time, Liberty magazine had the second largest circulation of any magazine in the world. Of course, Saturday Evening Post was number 1. But even though she got these assignments, she continued to work as a pulp illustrator. And during World War II, her career only got bigger in the pulps. And she was offered work for different publishers. Rather than signing Irene Zimmerman, she began to sign them Irene Endres, using her mom's maiden name. There's another odd thing. When she worked for Street and Smith, she signed her work Robert E. Lee. And you'll see a couple of really nice pulps, like Western Story and stuff, is signed Robert E. Lee. And if you're wondering how I ever put that one together, when one of her Liberty assignments that she got, she signed it 3 times on the cover because it was such big exposure to millions of people. She didn't want to be known only as Irene Zimmerman because she also had something invested in Irene Endress and Robert E. Lee. So all 3 names appear and in the thing. And so I was like, yeah, why would that be, right? Anyway. Here's a bizarre one. In 1942, Rangeland Romance introduced a new monthly feature called My Big Moment by Irene Endress. And there's an introductory paragraph right up there, and it says the following, quote, "Somewhere laid carefully away among the cherished memories of every girl is her life's one big moment. Irene Endress, gifted young artist, has been retained by Rangeland Romances to illustrate these moments in the lives of its readers. Please send us a brief account of your own big moment today. Perhaps in the next issue, yours may appear on this page," unquote. So from 1945 to 1947, she painted 11 covers for detective mystery pulps such as Crack Detective, Speed Detective, and 10 Detective Aces. And she signed these mystery pulps with the gender-neutral name just Endress. All of these mystery covers featured characters that the face and the hands that were directly swiped from Rafael de Soto. At that time, he was the top cover artist of this type of genre. And this led to the mistaken but popular belief that Endress was a pen name for de Soto rather than a pen name for Irene Zimmerman. And but that's the true story. For the rest of her life, Irene Zimmerman continued to live in the Endress family home in Brooklyn. She never married and she had no children. She died at home at the age of 59 in 1967 and is buried in the Endress family plot in Brooklyn's Greenwood Cemetery. One of the things that people always say about male pulp artists is that, and male pulp writers, is that they're a bunch of alcoholics. There's some truth to that, but that's not a completely true statement. And a similar thing occurs to me with Irene Zimmerman, is that you could make a sort of a blanket statement that all women pulp artists had unsuccessful marriages and no children. It's not actually a completely true statement, but it is. It helps, I think, to appreciate the challenges and struggles that they had to have as people that wanted a career in a field in which they were unwelcome. So the one exception to it is Gloria Stoll. She's born in 1923 in a place that she calls the Bronx. Her mother was Anne Vera Fenimore, and her father was Charles Theophile Stoll. Gloria was her only child. Her dad was a World War I veteran. He received the Distinguished Service Cross and the Croix de Guerre. I think he was a colonel when he finally retired. He was a commercial artist and had an advertising business with Raymond Thayer, who was another pulp illustrator. But when the Depression came, he had to close the advertising because that's all advertising was completely devastated because manufacturing didn't exist during the Great Depression. In 1936, little Gloria went to music and art, the first semester it ever opened. And unfortunately, 2 years later, in her junior year, her father died of a cerebral hemorrhage. And so the mom had to raise her, and she got a job working for Universal Pictures as a clerical worker at Rockefeller Center. And in 1940, when she graduated from the Music and Art High School, she had hoped to get a scholarship to go study at one of the great art schools in New York City, like Pratt or Cooper Union. But in fact, the women never received those. Those always went to boy students. So the best that she could get was a scholarship to something called the Display Institute, where young women artists were supposedly trained to be display technicians or display graphic type people. But in fact, it was only a commercial business, and they were just paying tuition and receiving no income. And so she really hated working for this place, and after a few months, she just quit. And she found a paying job instead at an insurance company, which paid well, but she really, really hated that job. And so she's working there for a couple of months, and she was so angry about everything, I guess, that she took her art portfolio and threw it in the incinerator at her tenement that she lived in Brooklyn. The janitor in the building, this stuff all comes down a chute into the basement, and he loads it into the furnace or else out to the garbage. But he saw her artwork and said, wow, this stuff is great. I think I'll show it to that guy, Rafael de Soto, who lives on the 3rd floor. And so she took it up to him, and he said, what? She threw this out. I mean, she has a lot of talent. Tell her to come up right now to the house. And so she came running up there, and he said, you can do it. And in fact, you could use my place as a studio. Now, don't get the wrong idea. Ralph was the sweetest guy on earth. He was married at the time of Marion, and that's just what he was like. He was a really, really nice guy. So she became his assistant, and she worked with him for a long time, helping him to do his stuff. And then he helped her to get some assignments for the publisher he was working for. So she became her own artist, and but they still shared a studio for like 5 years or something. And she began to do mystery pulps, which is unusual because women were always seeing and doing love type stuff. But she was literally 18, 19 years old by the time, and so it was quite remarkable that there was this person doing this. She worked also for like other titles too, Detective Tales, Black Mask, and stuff. You could see that she's influenced by Rafael de Soto, and they're a little hard to distinguish from each other, and she never signed her work for these mystery type pulps. But in fact, de Soto, although he was such a sweet guy, he was really, truly a Spaniard. And so I knew him my whole life growing up and stuff. And he was always grappling with questions that I would consider, anyway. So he was a devout Catholic. And if you've ever seen any churches in Spain, the altars and the statues and the paintings and stuff are remarkably gruesome. And so there's something devout and sweet about Ralph, but there's also something kind of gruesome about his work. And there's nothing like that in her work. So her work is similar to his in every way, except there's a out-and-out sweetness in her work that she's doing. I don't know why, but they both seem like nice people rather than like a horrible conflict to me. And so again, I like the idea that, we can all be given an assignment and someone says, go make something just horrible, make horrible things. And she'll, oh, okay. And then she makes these really sweet things and brings them back. And so people start out thinking, I'm selling my soul to the devil when I go to work for someone else as a commercial artist, because I should be home making work that expresses myself. But in fact, she really is expressing herself. I mean, that's the best way you can tell her work from his work, is that she just has this, you really can imagine this 19-year-old girl is responsible for this, and they have her spirit comes through, So anyway, for like the next 8 years, she just kept selling tons and tons of work for mystery pulps that come from Popular, but also primarily she did tons and tons of love stuff. So all story love, love novels, love short stories, new love, rangeland romances and romance western. Again, she did tons of interiors, but lots and lots of covers too. While she was doing all this work, she continued to study. She went to the Art Students League, she studied at the Society of Illustrators, and one of her teachers that she was most influenced by, she said, was Harvey Dunn. And it's just interesting because Dunn, along with Thornton Oakley and N.C. Wyeth, was also a pupil of Howard Pyle. So here we see this nice legacy going on. Her career abruptly ended in 1949 when she married Fred Karn, and they moved to Pittsburgh because he was teaching at Carnegie Mellon in the coal industry as a chemist. And but they raised 3 children, and she's always continued to paint and draw and to make collages, and she also became an art teacher. So her work was exhibited at the Brooklyn Museum, the Carnegie Museum of Art, and everybody's shocked. Last year she had a solo show at the Norman Rockwell Museum in Massachusetts. She still lives in Pittsburgh, and she still's hard at work, and she's 95 years old. Well, that's it. So if you want to see more detailed things or find out about the other 10 women working in pulps, go ahead to pulpartist.com. And I'm going to be here until Sunday morning, but if you want to ask me anything and you don't want to stand up and make a fool of yourself, you can just talk to me anytime. I'll be here. But if you like to stand up and want to bring the conversation into another area, please ask any questions you have. Unless Mike says that's it, let's do the next one.
What do they call it? Someone told me I'm called the Great Disruptor.
No. That's fine. We got a lot to do tonight, so.
You've been listening to a Pulp Event podcast, brought to you by the Pulp Net, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines, for over 20 years. Please visit us online at thepulp.net. Thank you for listening, and keep reading the pulps. The Pulp Event podcast is copyright 2019.